Have you ever stopped and wondered why our workplaces are set up the way they are? With managers, departments, and all those performance reviews? Well, believe it or not, these things didn't just pop up overnight. Nope, they're actually the result of more than 100 years of trial and error, big ideas, and total revolutions in how we think about work. To really get where we are today, we've got to look back at where it all started. So let's trace this incredible journey of management, one step at a time. Okay, so think of this timeline as our roadmap for this whole explainer. As you can see, it's not just one single brilliant idea. It's more like a series of waves, where each new idea builds on or sometimes completely pushes back against the one that came before it. We're going to start our journey way back in the age of factories and machines, and we're going to travel all the way to today's world with its focus on tech and collaboration. Let's dive in. So, here's our game plan. We'll break this story down into 5 main chapters. We'll start with the chaos of the very first factories, then move to the quest to build the perfect machine of an organization. After that comes the game changer, the discovery of the human element. Then we'll see how managers started dealing with modern complexity, and finally, we'll take a peek at what might be next. All right, let's set the scene. Picture it's the late 1800s, early 1900s. The Industrial Revolution is firing on all cylinders. And for the very first time in history, you've got these massive factories with thousands of people working under a single roof. It was a brand new world of work, and frankly, it was a mess. This was the big $100 million question. I mean, before this, most work was done in little shops or out on the farm. But now, you've got these gigantic, super complex operations. How in the world do you structure them? How do you train thousands of people for jobs that didn't even exist a few years ago? How do you get everyone pulling in the same direction? The old ways just weren't going to cut it. They needed a whole new philosophy, a new science of management, and they needed it yesterday. So the very first real attempt to answer this problem is what we now call the classical perspective. The core idea here was pretty radical at the time. Think of an organization less like a group of people and more like a finely tuned machine. The belief was if you could just get the design of the machine perfect, it would run with absolute peak efficiency. Now, this machine thinking wasn't just one single idea. It actually grew along 3 main branches. First, you had scientific management, which zoomed in on the individual worker's job. Then you had administrative principles, which looked at the organization as a whole. And finally, you had bureaucratic organization, which was all about creating logical, stable structures. And here's the kicker. All 3 were built on one powerful and pretty controversial assumption, that people are basically rational and predictable. The first branch, scientific management, is almost always linked to one guy, Frederick Winslow Taylor. His idea was a complete bombshell back then. He basically said, hey, we can scientifically study every single part of a job, figure out the one absolute best way to do it, and then just train workers to follow that one method, perfectly. He even said workers could be retooled like machines. So how did this actually work? Well, Taylor laid out these 4 key principles. First, use scientific methods like time and motion studies to figure out the most efficient way to do any task. Second, you carefully select workers who have the right skills for that specific job. Third, you train them relentlessly in that one best way. And fourth, management's job is to do all the thinking and planning, freeing up the workers to just execute. If you want a real-world example, think of a fast food place like McDonald's. Every single step, from how long the fries are cooked to the exact scoop for them, is a direct descendant of Taylor's scientific, efficiency-obsessed approach. So what do we make of this today? Now, this is a pro tip if you're ever tested on this stuff, you have to show both sides. On the plus side, it gave us some huge innovations, like paying people based on performance and creating formal training programs. The whole idea of actually studying a job to make it better was revolutionary. But the downside was huge. By treating people like machines, it completely ignored their social needs, their creativity, and their basic desire to do meaningful work. And this tension between efficiency and humanity becomes one of the biggest themes in the whole story of management. Okay, let's shift gears to our second classical branch, bureaucracy. Now, I know today that word has all sorts of negative feelings attached to it, right? We think of endless paperwork, long lines, and tons of red tape. But the guy who came up with it, Max Weber, actually saw it as the perfect, ideal way to run an organization. His goal was to get rid of the old system where you got a job just because you were the boss's cousin. He wanted a new system, one based on pure logic and fair rules. So what did Weber's ideal blueprint look like? It was all about being rational.
You'd have a clear division of labor, so everyone knew exactly what their job was, a strict hierarchy, so everyone knew who their boss was. People were hired based on their technical skills, what they knew, not who they knew. And everything, I mean everything, was written down as a rule to make sure it was consistent. The end goal? To create a perfectly predictable organization that would keep running smoothly no matter who came or went.
So, why does bureaucracy have such a bad reputation? Well, it turns out that the very things designed to create stability can also cause huge problems. That intense focus on rules, that leads to what we call red tape. That strict hierarchy, it can make decision making painfully slow. And because the whole system is built to be stable, it can be incredibly resistant to change. This is the exact trade off that so many big organizations like government agencies or huge corporations still wrestle with every single day. All this focus on machines, on rules, on perfect efficiency, it left out one massive, critical piece of the puzzle: the person, the actual human being doing the work. And that single question would become the spark for the next great revolution in management. And that brings us to the humanistic perspective. And this was a 180-degree turn. It basically argued that if you want to understand how an organization works, you first have to understand people, their behaviors, their needs, their attitudes. It put the focus squarely back on the employees, arguing that they were the most important asset, not just some interchangeable parts in a big machine. The big bang for this whole movement came from a series of studies done at a telephone factory called the Hawthorne Works. Now get this, researchers originally went in to study how physical things like the amount of light in a room affected how productive the workers were. They had a simple hypothesis: better lighting equals more output. But what they found instead? Well, it changed everything. They discovered something truly bizarre. No matter what they did, whether they turned the lights up or turned them down, productivity went up. The key insight was that the workers weren't responding to the lighting at all. They were responding to the attention. For the first time ever, someone was actually asking for their opinions and treating them like they mattered. This became known as the Hawthorne effect, and it was the first real proof that human and social factors were absolutely critical to performance. This new human-focused view was summed up perfectly by a theorist named Douglas McGregor and his Theory X and Theory Y. Think of Theory X as the old-school classical way of thinking. You assume workers are lazy, hate their jobs, and need to be constantly watched and controlled. A Theory X manager is a micromanager. But Theory Y flips that on its head. It assumes that people are naturally motivated, that they can be self-directed, and that they're creative problem solvers. A Theory Y manager acts more like a coach, empowering their team. A perfect real-world example of Theory Y in action is a company like Google, famous for giving its engineers creative freedom and dedicated time for personal projects. Okay, so we've got these two powerful but kind of opposing ideas: the classical push for machine-like efficiency and the humanistic focus on people's needs. But by the middle of the 20th century, the world was just getting way more complex. You had global supply chains, super fast technological change, crazy markets. Neither of those old perspectives was enough on its own. Managers needed a whole new set of tools to handle all this complexity. And this led to a new wave of more sophisticated approaches. You had management science, which brought math and data into decision-making to solve complex problems like logistics. But there were two other ideas that really changed the game for the modern manager, and you absolutely need to know them: systems thinking and the contingency view. Systems thinking teaches us that an organization isn't just an isolated box. It's actually an open system. It takes in inputs from the outside world like materials, people, and information, and then it transforms them into outputs. The crucial idea here is that all the parts are connected. A decision the marketing team makes to run a huge sale is going to have a massive ripple effect on production, on finance, on customer service. A good manager learns to see the whole system, not just their own little corner of it. And that brings us to what is maybe the most practical, down-to-earth idea in modern management: the contingency view. After decades of searching for that magical one best way to manage, this view basically says it depends. The right management technique is contingent. It depends on the situation you're in. You wouldn't manage a team of artists the same way you'd manage a construction crew, right? The key application here is simple but powerful. First, diagnose the situation, then choose the right tool for that specific problem. There's no universal answer. Which brings us right up to today, because this story is far from over. Management thinking is still evolving, all the time, pushed forward by new technologies and new social expectations. I mean, just look at the last few decades. The 1980s gave us the quality revolution with total quality management, which empowered every single employee to help improve the process.
Then, the internet boom of the 90s and 2000s completely rewired how we work, opening the door for things like remote work, e-commerce, and instant global teamwork. Every single one of these trends adds another layer, another tool, to the modern manager's toolkit.
And that leaves us with this final big question. We've gone on this incredible journey from treating people like machines to empowering them as creative partners, from searching for the one best way to learning how to adapt to any situation. So, as things like AI, remote work, and huge global challenges continue to shake up our world, what do you think is next? What's going to be the next big management idea that defines the decades to come? Because one thing is for sure, the evolution never stops.